So thank you all for coming. To quote my favorite character from the novel, well, okay, everybody here looks happy to see me. I must have wandered into the wrong house, or in this case, the wrong library. But you seem like a friendly bunch, so I think I'll get started. Okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to give a discussion of this book.
Oh, I thought you were doing God Has a Plan for you.
Oh, well, there's that. There's that, and I'm sure he does. Yeah, let's let him look elsewhere while I'm talking. So I don't want to rile anybody's feathers here. Hey, Michael. So what I'll do is we'll divide this into three parts. I'll discuss the book. I will read several excerpts from the book, and then I will open the floor. Sounds kind of biblical, don't you think? Open the floor to questions, comments, and as an old boss of mine like to say, obscene limericks. So if you have any, please let me know.
I'll start writing.
I could use them at my next meeting. So the book itself. The book is called What's in Hope's Back Pocket, and it tells the life story of a man named Eskander Mora who discovers solipsism. It explains what attracted him to solipsism and how solipsism influences his relationships with the people around him. So a little backstory, what exactly is solipsism? Solipsism is a philosophy that dates back at least to 450 BC, and it began simply as the belief that nothing in life can be proved. And over the centuries, it has evolved so that when somebody is a solipsist, they believe that everything that happens around them exists only in their imagination, that nothing outside of them is real, because when they die, everything is going to disappear. So they can't prove that anything ever really existed to begin with. One could counter with the argument, well, okay, other people in the past have died and the world hasn't stopped existing. But the solipsist will tell you, no, other people haven't died because other people haven't existed except in my own mind, which is to say the present and all of history are simply an illusion that exists only up here. So that is basically what Eskander ends up believing, and we read about why he embraces the philosophy and how it affects him and the people around. Okay. The story is divided into 5 parts and 41 chapters. Part 1 covers Eskander from the ages of 7 to 13. It starts with the death of his grandfather, which triggers a crisis in his life, and it concludes with the death of his grandmother. 2 important things happen during part 1. First is that at the age of 9, his family moves from Bensonhurst in Brooklyn to Midwood in Brooklyn. And also at around that time, Eskander reaches sexual maturity and realizes that he is completely asexual. He has no sexual desire whatsoever for anybody else, male, female, anything in between. Okay, 3 years go by and we come to part 2. This covers Eskander from the ages of 16 to 24. He discovers solipsism. He realizes that he's happiest by himself. And he does have friends, but he really comes to embrace his solitude. During part 2, he goes to college, he graduates, He gets a good job, which he ends up keeping for the rest of his life, and he buys a home of his own. Part 3 covers Eskander from the ages of 37 to 40. So 13 years have passed since the end of Part 2. His father dies, so his mother moves in with him. This is an uncomfortable situation because following his father's death, his mother starts to crack and she ends up dying by the end of Part 3. 15 more years pass before we come to Part 4, and this covers Eskander from the ages of 55 to 56. Eskander, who is convinced that he's incapable of loving another human being, rents a male escort for a night, quote unquote. The escort's name is Elijah, to see if maybe sex can lead to love, but of course, there is no sex. And of course, there is no love, but Eskander turns out to be fine with both. 21 years pass before we come to the last part, which is Part 5. And this covers Eskander from the ages of 77 to his death at the age of 78. He's a very sick man. He has acute myeloid leukemia, which is the disease that killed his grandfather. But looking over his life, he will realize before the end that as lives go, it's been a really pretty damn good one, and he has no regrets. So let me give you a very brief overview of some of the more important characters who will be mentioned in the book. First is Louis Mora, who is Eskander's grandfather. Eskander grows up living in a two-family house where he and his parents live upstairs and his grandparents live downstairs. The next character you'll want to pay attention to is a man named Joseph Abich. Joseph is Eskander's father's best friend, and Eskander is so fond of Joseph that he calls him Uncle Joe, and he calls Joseph's wife Aunt Elaine. Joseph's wife's name is Elaine. Joseph and Elaine have a son who is exactly Eskander's age, and his name is Ben. And Ben and Eskander have a close but difficult relationship, in part because it turns out Ben is jealous of the relationship that Eskander has with Ben's parents. They end up going to college together and they remain friends their entire lives. Ben will eventually marry a woman named Lauren, who has a very calming influence on him. The person that we will meet is Brian McAllister, who is a friend Eskander makes when he moves to Midwood at the age of 9. Midwood, by the way, is where Ben and Joseph and Elaine live. The last and probably the most important character we're going to find out about is a man named Josue Brule. He is Filipino on his mother's side and German on his father's side. Josue is a friend Eskander makes in college. He is a friend of Eskander's roommate and becomes Eskander's closest friend for life. And he has an incalculable influence on Eskander. Josue is wise, caring, enormously compassionate, and knows how to make other people happy, but unlike Eskander, has no idea how to make himself happy. Also, completely unlike Eskander, Josue is very sexually active. As he says, he doesn't play favorites, but he never settles down with anyone. Because to him, sex is just something that one goes through and then moves away from. So, with all that in mind, don't worry, you will not be tested on this thing. I'm going to read a number of excerpts that I have very colorfully marked here. And I'm going to start with uh, the very first sentence of the book. This takes place at Eskander's grandfather's funeral, and it sets up the crisis that emerges in Eskander's life. So chapter 1, which is called Time to Say Goodbye, begins like this. Later, he would think of his childhood as a series of funerals. This was his first, and he was only 7. And remember, no one is ever really dead until the day you forget him. So said Joseph Abbott when trying to conclude the eulogy at Louis Mora's funeral. It was the first time Louis's grandson Eskander had been to a death service or a burial at a cemetery, but his grandfather, his father's father, had been the most beloved man in his life. The only man, in fact, who Eskander ever loved. The only person, really. Because when his grandfather died, Eskander lost the ability to feel anything more than a passing curiosity toward people, living or dead. Memories became dead themselves, atrophied, abstracted, and it would be years, decades even, before they could give him any comfort or sense of familiarity. We're at the funeral, and a few minutes later, while there, another, though smaller, crisis occurs. Eskander's mother, whose name is Allie, gets into a fight with Eskander's grandmother, who has just lost her husband, so it's Allie's mother-in-law. Because his grandmother is convinced that it's because of something her daughter-in-law did that her husband ended up dying. So she starts yelling at her, and Allie starts yelling back, and this whole scene occurs. And Joseph, who is Paul is Eskander's father, Paul's best friend, and is a quiet, calm, sedate person, tries to calm things down, and this is what we read. Then, after a moment, Joseph walked over and said, "Tell me a story, Paul. Tell me something to make me smile." Joseph knew what he was doing. He wanted to calm down his friend, but he also needed to calm down himself. Musingly, Paul said, Okay, sure. I have a good one to tell you." Quickly, he walked Joseph away, happy not to think about Allie and his mother just then. "You know what my son did before the summer?" He never referred to Eskander as my son unless he was especially proud. "Do tell," Joseph said. "What did he get himself up to?" "He wanted to do something special for Pop." That was the name Paul always used for his father. You know how close they were. I do. No reason in particular, that's just the kind of person Eskander is. Anyway, he walked out into the backyard one afternoon and over to the lilac bush because he wanted to make him a bouquet. So he pulled 8 lilacs off the bush, all on their stems, then asked Allie when he got inside for a vase and some water and put them in. Then he found a ribbon somewhere. I don't know where it came from, but Allie likes to wrap presents. So he took the ribbon and tied it around the top of the vase and made a bow. Then he brought the vase downstairs, handling it very carefully, and gave the lilacs to Pop. They were just for him, he said. Joseph laughed. Your mother must have loved that. She understood. At least she did when he told her that they were for her too. Joseph nodded. He was so proud of himself. And of course, Pop loved it. But here's the thing. The next day he walked downstairs to ask after them, and they were still there. They'd placed the vase in the middle of the cocktail table. And he went down the day after too. But by the 3rd day, the flowers were starting to die. So you know what Pop did? During the night, when he knew Eskander would be asleep, he walked into the backyard, pulled, not cut, so Eskander couldn't tell the difference, 8 more lilacs off the bush, arranged them in just the same way in the vase, and threw the old lilacs out. And when Eskander walked downstairs to visit him, he was thrilled to see that the lilacs were still alive. He didn't understand yet that things die. Joseph sighed and thought to himself, he does now, but didn't say anything. He was concerned that a child who didn't understand death would come to never accept it and end up living in a world of his own. Paul, whom Joseph thought was starting to look unsteady, continued. Then he became involved with other things. Okay, so 2 weeks passed, and while he was downstairs one day, he said, Grandpa, something is missing, something that used to be here, but he was laughing. Pop hugged him as tightly as he could and said, it must have been lilacs. Paul shook his head. It became a catchphrase between them. So whenever anything would disappear, one or the other would say, it must have been lilacs. It must have been lilacs, Joseph repeated and smiled. They were so beautiful together. So, okay. As mentioned, time passes. Eskander realizes that he's asexual. He moves from Bensonhurst to Midwood, which is where Ben lives. But Eskander becomes close to a kid named Brian who lives in the apartment building that Eskander moves into. Brian will play a very important role in the story in part 2. End of part 1, after a number of years had passed, and Eskander is now 13. His grandmother, who had spent the last 2 years in a senior residence in Long Island and finally became happy, good God, ends up dying. And now Eskander is at the funeral. His parents are at the funeral. Ben is at the funeral. And is what we read. When it was over, Ben walked up to Eskander, put his hands on his shoulders and said, so tell me how you are, really. Which was the exact same thing that Joseph had said to Paul at Lewis's funeral. Obviously, Ben had been listening. But Eskander didn't react the way his father had. Instead, he said, I'm fine, really, as though he were surprised at having been asked. This was the 7th funeral he'd been to in the previous 6 years, and at each one he'd felt less attached to the person who died than he'd felt at the funeral before it, no matter how he'd felt about that person when they were alive. But he knew why. His last grandparent was dead. He just turned 13, and childhood was over. At least in the sense that childhood is the time for making friends. And even at that young age, Eskander realized, or perhaps decided, that you made only one true friend in life, your first friend, because everyone who followed was just a replacement. And by first friend, of course, I'm talking about his grandfather. So, 3 years pass. We come to part 2. Eskander and Ben are going to college together in Brewster, which, as Eskander later explains, is slightly upstate. And Brian is going to Vanderbilt down in Nashville. Eskander sees Brian a little bit less and sees Ben obviously more. He still feels close to Brian because Brian, unlike Ben, is a more understanding, more respectful person. But he's known Ben all his life, so he kind of keeps him on because it's become a habit. Eskander discovers solipsism before he leaves for college. He doesn't know where it comes from, but he does know that it answers a lot of questions he's had, and it seems to explain a lot of how he feels about things. Ben, unfortunately, never buys into this. He always thinks that it's Iskander's way of taking an easy way out of responsibility. But Iskander doesn't care because ultimately Ben isn't even real. So does it really matter what he thinks? So he's fine with that. And they still remain friends. In college, as I've mentioned before, Iskander meets Haswe, and Haswe, as I'd also said, is very sexually active, whereas Iskander is asexual. Okay. In their second year in college, Iskander gets a letter from Brian. Brian will be coming home. They still live in the same apartment building in Midwood to visit his parents. But Brian, in the meantime, has also met a woman named Emily, who he's really crazy about and who he's been seeing for a year. He wants to know if Iskander would like to spend a weekend with the two of them. Now, Iskander feels very uncomfortable about this because he thinks he's just going to feel like a third wheel. Primarily because Brian now has something, a significant other in his life, which Iskander knows he's never going to have because Iskander is asexual. He doesn't know what to do. So he decides to ask Ben what he thinks and decides to ask Haswe what he thinks. And understandably, they give him completely opposite opinions. Ben tells him, don't be ridiculous. You're going to feel like a third wheel. You're going to feel like an appendage. It's really nasty of Brian to even ask you. He obviously doesn't care about your feelings, or he wouldn't have asked you to begin with. But Haswe takes a very different view of it. And one afternoon, when Iskander is in Haswe's dorm room, they are discussing this, and Haswe is speaking, and this is what we read. Is a sexual bond more important than a non-sexual one? Iskander laughed. Look at who's asking, he said. Why don't you tell me? It can be, Haswe said seriously, but it isn't always. Iskander thought back to what Julian had told him about Haswe the year before, about how a lot of the people he knew were just interested in him for sex. Well, that's all well and good, he said, but let's say they love each other. Let's say they do, Haswe said and stretched. But here's the thing to remember, and trust me, it's hard to realize. It's a different kind of love. And it doesn't do you any good to think of it as more meaningful or more important or better. Look at it this way. Haswe leaned forward. Do you love your mother? Iskander nodded. Of course you do. Does your father love your mother? Iskander nodded again. Of course he does. Now tell me, which love is more meaningful? Which love is better? Your father's love or yours? You're probably thinking that your father's love for your mother means more than your love does because his love is sexual. But you know something? If that were true, if your father's love for your mother meant more to her than your love did, it would follow that if, for some ungodly reason, she had to choose between you because only one of you could live and the other had to die, she would choose him because his love, to continue this warped logic, is more meaningful and good. But you know what? I bet you anything that if one of you had to die, she would get over losing him, but would never get over losing you, her son, even though your relationship isn't sexual. So please don't tell me, and please don't ever believe that sexual relationships are better or more important than non-sexual ones. I have to tell you, I cried after I wrote that paragraph because I never saw that argument coming. It was just there. Just because I created characters doesn't mean I know everything there is to know about them. Sometimes they tell me what they want to say. It's like a stop putting words in my mouth. Let me speak for myself type of thing. So, we authors have very fraught relationships with the people who we create. Okay. As things turn out, he ends up spending the weekend with them. He ends up having a genuinely terrible time, even though they are extremely respectful, but he feels very left out nonetheless. And eventually he and Brian end up going their own ways, but he realizes that he has something special, even though it's non-sexual, with Hasue. And Hasue, he will realize by the end of the book, is kind of almost an elevated version of who Brian was. Okay. Years pass. They all graduate. Eskander becomes a chemist. Ben becomes an architect. And Hasue, who is actually a year ahead of them, becomes a nurse. They keep in touch with each other after graduation, and within a few years, they end up living within 10 miles of each other and all right near Brewster, where they went to school and had some of the happiest times together. Okay, now 13 years pass, and we come to part 3. Eskander is 37, and his father very suddenly dies of a heart attack one morning. His mother, who has nowhere to go and doesn't work, so can't afford the rent on her apartment, comes to live with him. At first, Eskander is a little skeptical. I'm sorry, did I say at first? Eskander is a little skeptical. They'd always been close, or as close as he could be to anyone when he was growing up. But once he left for college, he started to see that she had become a very needy person. And now, without her husband, she's become a very, very needy person. Still, she has no place else to go. So, he has a house with 3 bedrooms. So it's like, yeah, sure, come in, move with me, make yourself happy. It'll be fine. Things don't work out. And one night, trying to decide how to handle living with his mother, Eskander does what he did when the situation with Brian came up. So he calls Ben and he calls Hasue. Ben typically gives him a very negative answer, and he says, just ignore her and tell her that if she's not happy, find someplace else to go. At this point, Eskander does not realize that Ben and his own mother, his quote unquote Aunt Elaine, do not get along. So that will explain why Ben says what he says. But Hasue, of course, has a very, very different and infinitely more compassionate take on the situation. They're on the phone, and this is what we read. This is Hasue speaking. You're her only living connection to him. Look, you're the one who she decided to live with. She loves you, but she feels she's been let down, disappointed. Somebody, your father, had promised to be there forever and always, but he wasn't. So now it's your turn. Chances are you'll outlive her, so she won't have to worry about losing you the way she lost him. Of course, and I shouldn't say this, but I will anyway, he laughed. If you die first, she dies with you, right? At least according to the way you see things. He breathed in. But seriously, plan things that you can do together. Give her what to look forward to. Give her things to count on. Take half the time that you spend on painting. Painting is, by the way, a way he occupies a lot of his time. And spend it with her. And every Saturday, go someplace with her. There are plenty of places to go. I know there are, but she wouldn't enjoy them. She doesn't have to. She'll enjoy you. Just being together. You can drive around for an hour or two. There are a lot of beautiful towns around here. And who knows what you're going to find. Maybe you'll find a place that you can keep going back to. And don't worry. As I said, it's not going to be forever. And all Eskander could think about was what Joseph had said at his grandfather's funeral. Buy flowers. Give flowers to the living, to the people you love, to the people you know, to your family, to your friends. Let them know that you love them. Let them know that they mean a lot to you. And please, do it before it's too late. Because if you don't do it now, Haswe said, you're only going to regret it for the rest of your life, and you'll end up missing her. That's what people miss the most, their lost opportunities. He might have been remembering Joseph's words or reading Eskander's mind at the funeral, but that, of course, would have been impossible because Haswe hadn't been there and Eskander hadn't met him until 9 years later. But what if Haswe, what if I don't really love her? Then Haswe said, he'll only miss her more. We'll have nothing else to look back on. Well, yeah, she remains unhappy. In spite of what he tries to do, he remains unhappy. But for her 70th birthday, he decides to treat her to something very special. He gets tickets to Showboat, which is on Broadway, and he takes her to the Waldorf Astoria for a weekend. They check in on Friday and they check out on Sunday. She enjoys some of what they're doing. She has a good time at the show, but overall, they're not really happy, and it's not turning out to be the weekend that he hoped it would be. When he pulls out away from the hotel on Sunday morning, we read this interesting passage that puts a slightly different spin on solipsism. He is the valet, the parking attendant, and this is what we read. When he handed the valet his parking stub the next morning and watched him run toward the garage, Eskander thought back to the moment less than 2 days before that the same valet handed him the stub as he and Allie were getting out of the car. That was a golden moment, he thought, something magical, because it was the start of a weekend that he hoped and expected would be great. The act, the passing of a scrap of paper from one person to another, was simple and unremarkable, but to Eskander it was sublime. Whereas to the valet, he was sure, it meant nothing. Just one more car to park in the hotel's garage, or if the garage were full, a nearby garage. That's such an exercise, and both Eskander and the valet were there. Both handled the paper, both lived in and through the same moment, could be interpreted so differently by the two people involved in it, must have meant that everyone really did create their own life, that there was no objective reality. Well, things do not get better for either one of them. And unfortunately, at the end of part 3, his mother dies, never really having been happy. Now, 15 years pass. We come to part 4. Eskander is now 55. And he decides he's going to do something unusual. He's going to rent an escort for the night. And for reasons that are gone into in great detail, he decides to rent a man. Okay. He remains happy. He remains a fairly solitary person. But he wants to see if maybe sex will lead to happiness. Now, yes, he understands that usually closeness with another human being leads to sex. Though he also understands that there are people who believe that in failing relationships, maybe if we have more sex, we'll get close again. And he still blames himself for what he perceives as his inability to get close to people, and thinks that maybe if he had been able to get closer to his mother, he could have made her happier. So he is at Josue's house one afternoon, and they're talking about how he, Eskander, feels in his relationships with people, and very open about the fact that since his grandfather died, he is completely incapable of loving anybody else. One thing to note, in this and later excerpts, and there aren't too many later excerpts, so don't worry. Josue always refers to him as Skander. Skander was the nickname his mother used to call him by when he was growing up. And the only other person who ever called him that is Josue. And he just started calling him that pretty much from the time they met. And it always makes Eskander feel good. He finds it a term of endearment. So the two of them are sitting on Josue's couch, and Josue is speaking, and here's how I see it. You told me that one of the reasons you wanted to get together with him to begin with was to see if you could love somebody. Skander, I don't know how you define love, but if you don't love me, if you don't love Ben, and if you don't love Lauren, you have no fucking idea what love is to begin with. So stop looking for something you already have. You are capable of loving people. You just think that if you do, you're going to end up loving your grandfather, his memory, less. Because I remember one of the first things you told me is that everybody has only so much love that they can give. And maybe that's true. It's an interesting concept, but you have more than I realized. That's why I spoke to you the way I did when you first told me about him. And by the way, he is your friend and you're his. And that's in large part because you're capable of love. Trust me. So the man who Eskander meets is named Elijah, and Elijah lives in the city. And Eskander and Elijah start spending weekends together every month and a half. And Eskander is never quite sure how he feels about Elijah. And Elijah is never quite sure how he feels about Eskander. But bottom line, no, there is no sex, and no, there is no love. But they're both fine with that. Getting out of the subway one afternoon when he's going down to Elijah. We read this. And it says a lot about who Eskander is. Getting out of the subway and walking down 9th Avenue, he thought about something that had happened to him the week before. Maggie was out that day and so was Ken. So rather than spend his entire lunch hour in the cafeteria, he went for a walk first. There was a road that ran around the campus where he worked, and its periphery stretched for close to 1.5 miles and encompassed 6 buildings. It took him about 25 minutes to walk around once, and on the rare occasions that he did walk there, he always walked along the outside shoulder, the part of the road that was farthest from the buildings, and he always walked clockwise so he could face the oncoming traffic. That afternoon, when he'd almost made it back to his building, he saw a crowd of people coming toward him, walking 3 abreast, and also hewing to the outside shoulder. There may have been 15 or 20 of them. As they got closer, he thought that one of 2 things was going to happen. Either they would step aside to let him pass, or he would walk around them and let them pass. He could have veered off and walked straight inside, but decided not to, because he wanted to finish one complete round, and didn't step off the road and onto the grass, because that would have run counter to his plans. But when he and the crowd of people got within a few feet of each other, the most remarkable thing happened. Like a flock of birds suddenly changing course, they all made room for him. He remained on the outer edge of the road while they walked by. Later, he would realize that it was the most practical thing to do. For them, just one person required little deviation from their path, whereas for him to walk around 15 or 20 people would have required a lot more extra steps, but it helped him understand how much power he wielded by being alone. So, as things turn out, Eskander and Elijah end up spending 11 months together. And at the end, each realizes that what they had in their lives before they met each other was actually better than what either one could give the other. And they were happy in that the relationship helped them appreciate what they had. So they too part ways. Then 21 years pass, and we come up to part 5. Eskander is 77 when it opens and 78 when it closes. By this point, Eskander is a very sick man. He has acute myeloid leukemia, which is the disease that killed his grandfather. And he's known for a long time that he's been sick, but he has refused obstinately to see a doctor. Well, ultimately, he's gotten to a point where he can't put off seeing a doctor anymore. So he calls Hasway, both because Hasway is his closest friend and because Hasway, who used to be a nurse, still has a lot of connections in the healthcare industry where they live and knows a lot of people. During the course of this telephone conversation, Hasway is not playing dumb. He simply refuses to mention the word cancer because he wants to spare Eskander's feelings, but he wants to spare his own feelings. He doesn't want to acknowledge that his best friend is dying. At the end, big crying warning coming up. At the end of the conversation, Hasway tries to tell Eskander that life expectancy has come a long way from the time when they were young, and people are living a lot longer than they used to. But Eskander takes Hasway's statement and twists it into something surprisingly poignant. So, this is what we read. This is the beginning of chapter 39. On a Wednesday morning in the middle of March, Eskander woke up and realized that he wasn't well. For the past 3 years, he'd gotten up on occasion and decided that he didn't feel good, but this was different. This wasn't a decision, it was a realization. Decision implies choice and the existence of two or more bona fide options, but realization implies the acceptance that there are no options left. Called Hasway and let him know he was sick. You mean by sick? Hasway asked. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to play games. I just want to know what's wrong with you. I'm losing weight, a lot, more than you might have realized. I'm bruising easily, and I'm tired all the time. Sway didn't say anything. Could you give me the name of a doctor, please? Of course, Adrian Mazer. He's in Brewster. See, he wanted to say, I didn't even have to think about it. Okay, hold on, I'm writing this down, Eskander said. I had a pen. Sway thought that was sweet. What does he specialize in? He's a GP, Hasway said. He doesn't specialize in anything. Your symptoms could be caused by so many things, even some things you probably never thought of. Eskander laughed. Oh, I'm sure I've thought of everything, even things that haven't been invented yet. Hasway laughed back. Yeah, that sounds like you, covering all the bases. Look, I know him. Let me call him for you. I'll get you right in. Or do you need to go to the hospital now? I think I'm all right to wait. I mean, I woke up feeling terrible, but now, a few minutes, opened my eyes, having taken a few deep breaths, gotten over the shock that I can still open my eyes and take a few deep breaths. I feel better. Skander, Hasway said, laughing gently. 77 isn't old anymore. It was when we were children, but it isn't now. Sway, when we were children, 16 years old. Sway held back a tear. So 2 weeks pass. He goes to see Dr. Mazer, who tells him exactly what he already knows. And Dr. Mazer refers him to an oncologist named Bart Beloff, who has an office in the city. Eskander goes to visit Dr. Beloff on a Wednesday afternoon, which is his 78th birthday. This day he goes into the hospital. It's a Thursday. On Friday, Hasway, Ben, and Lauren come to visit him. Enjoys their company, has a great time seeing them. And then on Saturday, he realizes that the medication that they've put him on is making him really, really, really sick. So he calls everybody and asks them not to come. He talks to the doctor, and the doctor cuts the dose of his medication. But the doctor knows and Eskander knows that there's really no hope left. So just, make him as comfortable as they can. Sunday comes. Sunday is going to be Eskander's last full day alive. Something, however, is going to happen that night, which will let Eskander finally say goodbye to life and to everybody as he knows it without any regrets. He's almost there, but not quite. So Sunday morning, Hasway comes in to visit him and spend the day, and he's carrying a white plastic bag with him. And this is what we read. And this, by the way, is our last excerpt. So what have you got for me? Eskander asked. Or is that for you? He looked toward the bag. Oh, I'm sorry, Husway said anxiously. He kept his head down and fumbled with his bag. No, this is definitely for you. I just don't know how you're going to take it. But however you do, take it in the spirit in which it was intended. Skander, I want you to remember what it feels like to be happy again. Iskander didn't like that. The implication that he wasn't happy, or happy longer than he'd realized. But his face fell when he saw what Haswe took out of the bag, because in his hand he held 8 freshly cut lilacs. I still remember the story you told me, Haswe said. It must have been. And as he leaned over, Iskander grabbed his face in his hands and kissed him on the lips. Lilacs, he said. It must have been lilacs. I can't believe you still remember that, and it's been almost 60 years. Since I told you, I mean. It's been 71 years since my grandfather died. Haswe smiled. You'd be surprised at what sticks in the memory. Carefully, he placed the bag on the floor, because he'd also brought a glass vase with him, which he then pulled out. Just add water, he said, like they used to say on TV. You're my grandfather now, Iskander said. Excuse me, returning the lilacs I gave him 71 years ago. You even have the same skin color he did, light tan, a little darker than mine. I swear I've never told this to anyone, but at the end of a solipsist's life, all the people around him start to meld, to come together, to become one. Then the last step is when they become me. So that's who they all are, really? Just me. If you take solipsism literally and carry its logic to the nth degree. Does that make any sense? Haswe laughed. Not really, but in some crazy way, I suppose it does. You don't mind that I'm returning them then? Iskander shook his head. In this world, everything is borrowed. I borrowed life for 78 years. Now it's time to give it back. Don't say that, Haswe said. Haswe, Iskander said, I can say it not because it's true, but because it's all right. Haswe sighed heavily and looked away. He was losing his best friend. So how are things otherwise? He asked optimistically. Skander shut his eyes. Silly man, he said. I think I will end there and open the floor to questions, comments, and as promised, dirty limericks.
So if anybody on Zoom has a question, you can also unmute yourselves and ask. I have a question.
Oh, sure.
So a long time ago, I was also like sort of I wouldn't say I was a solipsist, but I dabbled in solipsism. Um, what sort of brought that to you, or like is that something you've thought of throughout your life? Is it just like a
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It is something I've thought about pretty much from the time I was young, and it was kind of brought home by an episode of The Twilight Zone that I watched when I was in high school about this convicted man who's sentenced to death and realizes that his life just keeps repeating in this endless circle.
right?
He's always sentenced to death. He's always executed. And then he comes back and he's in the same courtroom, but the people have changed. And that made me start to think, I wonder if maybe there's something to be said for this, because as happens with Iskander, there are enough questions that it answers that. Yeah, I think especially with young people, they always look to have big questions answered. They just feel more comfortable. not going through life saying, I don't understand this.
Mm.
And as we get older, I guess, we adjust and think it's okay to leave questions unanswered. But especially when we're young, we like to adopt philosophies that make us feel part of something, I would say.
Where did you come up with the name Eskander?
Okay, excellent question. I'm a huge fan of the Food Network, and on an episode of Diners, Drive-ins, and Dives, there was a chef named Eskander. It was a name I've never heard in my life. It's the Arabic equivalent, and Eskander is not an Arabic man, but it's the Arabic equivalent of Alexander. And I thought, I love this name. I've got to write something that has a character named Eskander. And I had just finished The Judges, and I was not going to write anything more. And it's like, no, I've got to. I love this name. I have to use it. And so I started writing notes to myself that turned into the book. And similarly, the name Hasway came from a chef on an episode of Chopped. And I saw his name before I heard it, and it's spelled Josue. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, I'm going to guess it is not pronounced Josu. And when I heard it pronounced, it's like, oh, another cool name. Oh God, now I have to incorporate him too. So that's really where it all came from.
That's neat. I just started the book and I'm almost through the funeral scene, and I was wondering, is it explained, or maybe I missed it or something? What was the connection between the grandfather and Eskander? Which is the only man he truly loved? Or what was that?
Yeah. Okay. So Eskander grows up in a two-family house. He and his parents live upstairs, and his grandparents live downstairs, and they share a backyard. Eskander and his grandfather were always very close. Eskander, even as a child, came across to some people as maybe a little standoffish, but he felt very close, for whatever the reason, to his grandfather in a way he could never feel close to his parents, a way he never felt close to his grandmother, who was a difficult person, and never felt as close to his mother's parents either. He always has friends, but he never quite feels close to them either. But his grandfather seems to be somebody who's always there for him, always accepting of him, and always supportive of him.
What's the inspiration for the title?
Okay, the inspiration for the title. Oh, this is a long story. Maybe 20 years ago, I went to an art gallery, the Hunterdon County something or other, which is down in Clinton, and they were having an exhibit of lithographs by living artists. I went to look at and they were all for sale. I mean, after the exhibit closed, they didn't want to have blank spaces on the wall. So I went down and I saw this lithograph that completely riveted me. It was a picture of a cross made of two popsicle sticks. One, of course, was broken. So it was smaller, the horizontal portion of the cross. And it was in a back pocket. And the title of the print was Hope's back pocket. Okay, this really, really fascinated me. And for like weeks afterward, I was thinking, it's really expensive. Well, maybe not. Maybe I could like, talk to the artist or something. So about 2 weeks go by. I call the museum and I say, yeah, you had this fascinating lithograph. I'd like to get some information on purchasing it. And the woman says, sure. What was it called? And I said, it was called Hope's Back Pocket. Okay, give me a second. She comes back to the telephone. Sir, yes? No, we never had a lithograph by that. I'm like, yes, you did. I can tell you exactly what room it was in, what wall it was on, and what window it was next to. And I explain it to her, and she says, okay, can you hold on a few more minutes? And I say, sure. She talks to somebody else or, puts on some, pre-recorded tape to make me believe that she was talking to somebody else. She comes back, she says, sir, no, there was no such lithograph ever on our premises. Well, okay, comes time for me to write the book. I start researching like crazy. Nothing is coming up. It's like, no, this does not exist only in my mind. Oh, damn, that's solipsism.
Yeah.
This does not exist only in my. I know, I saw it. But yeah, it just that's how the title came.
Wow.
And it's used by Ben when he and Eskander and Haswe are in college and they're out having dinner one night. And Ben explains that when he was growing up and his parents would take him on a long trip somewhere, his father liked to pass the time by up with this kind of open-ended question that he called what's in Hope's back pocket. And the idea was that if Hope were a person, what would he or she carry in his or her back pocket? And so there's a discussion on that. And then that's where the title for the book comes from.
Sure.
Yes.
How did you come up with the idea for lilacs to be in the back?
Oh, excellent. When I was growing up, we did have a lilac bush in our backyard. I never cut lilacs off and gave them to my grandfather. But as soon as the lilacs bloomed, and they would bloom like every April or May, I knew, summer is almost here. School is going to be over. We're going to be going away for the summer. And so lilacs for me always had this very positive connotation of something that really meant a lot. And when I wrote the story, I kind of regretted the fact that I had never given but my grandfather knew how much I loved him, given him any lilacs. But so lilacs in my mind had this very positive connotation, this feeling of closeness to somebody else. I still remember how I love the smell of it. And I probably haven't seen any live ones in, most of my life now.
Eric, if I could ask a question. I read the book and I don't want to give away the ending, but it was amazing to see the explosive ending that you chose. How did you come around that? To figure, to have that be the ending?
That's a great question. The ending was actually the first thing that came to my mind with the book, because I wanted and again, we're not giving anything away here, because there might be people who are going to be watching this, ex post facto. You like my little legal terminology there? Who I don't want to spoil anything. I deliberately wrote that ending so as to keep the question of the validity of solipsism completely open. It shows that you really can't prove that yes, it's valid or no, it's not valid. Does that answer
That
you?
is amazing.
Thank you. That was actually the easiest that whole last scene was actually the easiest. That just kind of, flowed out. It was unstoppable. And it was probably the one scene that I didn't change any of the wording in, except for the next to last line, which I'm not going to go into here. But the next to last line, I didn't like it when I sent it to my printer. I didn't like it when I got it back from him. I'm making change after change after God bless it. He's such a patient man. Change after change after change. And it's like, okay, I'm 99.999% satisfied with what I have. It's just going to be one of those things. I'm sitting by myself one afternoon. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, the perfect next to last line appears. I jump out of my chair. I run over to my computer. I cross out what was there, put this in, read it through, and literally for 2 hours, I cannot stop crying. It's like,
Oh,
so I contact my printer. It's like, can I make one more change? And he's like, but of course. So that was the one thing that I changed. But the rest of the last Steve was just like kind of an easy one.
I'm just gonna say, if you haven't read the book, don't peek.
Yes.
Don't peek. That last, you got to wait till you get there.
Everything really comes together at the end.
Eric, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's Lee. Hi. Two things.
You still? I think you might be muted.
Yeah, we can't hear you. Oh,
There we are.
Okay, how's that?
Good.
that's better.
Great. Eric, I apologize. We couldn't make it because my shoulder surgery is still acting up. But be that as it may, two little things you mentioned when you were reading the text. One was everything we have on earth is borrowed. And two, I believe you said Eskander took his grandmother to the Astoria, or whatever hotel, I forgot. Waldorf Astoria for a weekend. And I've often had that thought about borrowed things. I mean, does that make a solipsist? I don't know. But I often think, like you sign a mortgage, you do something else, and it's supposed to, give you title for life. Well, how long is life?
Exactly.
Not very long. Whether you borrow it or buy it, the effect is still the same.
Excellent point. Really
At
excellent.
the excursion to New York, my mother used to take me to a show and a dinner every so often. We'd go to Broadway and then have lunch or dinner at a place like Monleone's or Sardi's. And it just brought back a lot of nice memories I had with my mother. But
How cool.
your
Cool.
the book is I haven't read it yet, but you gave us a great set of cliff notes, and I can't wait to get into it.
Excellent. I think
Thanks, Eric.
I think you'll enjoy it.
I think this book is a good slow read because there's a lot of emotion happening. And so you read, 10 pages and you have to stop and go, wow. And and so that's a good slow read.
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent point. I found the same thing. There were a lot of scenes where it's like I was ready to write the next chapter. I just couldn't. I just had to, kind of build myself up to it. Again, it was much more emotional than anything I had ever done before. But it felt good. It felt good.
Painful and a gift to tap into that. To be able
I'm sorry.
You're very muffled.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, there
Uh,
we go.
It's a gift and painful to be able to tap into that rich emotion.
Yes, very, very, very. In fact, for the longest time after I had the idea for the book, I told myself, I don't want to put myself through this and, write about things that were very painful in my life. But one thing I realized that while writing it, I was actually manipulating those things the way I wanted them to go. So I was taking control of them. So they lost any power they might have had to upset me from years back. The one I found really difficult to write about was his father's death. My father didn't die anywhere near the way Iskander's father died. And my father passed away almost 35 years ago. And I thought up until I wrote out about that scene that, I was fine. And it was just, something that happened a long time ago and wasn't going to bother me again. But, oh, it bothered me again. So you never know when you start opening yourself up, you really never know what's going to show.
That's a gift of art. Yeah. Just the gift of being able to create something and experience it in a safe place.
Yes,
Beautiful.
yes, absolutely right. Right.
I'm going to continue my slow read.
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
Actually, I guess it's sort of two-pronged. Well, they're totally different questions, so feel free to answer them separately or however you like. Um, is any part of the, I mean, you said a bunch of times like, well, this is not how it happened to me, et cetera, et cetera. Is any part of the book autobiographical? And how long did it take you to write this? Because it's fairly voluminous. And
Okay.
I feel like the judges happened not that long ago.
Right.
So were you writing these like concurrently, or was it like the minute you put the judges down, you're like, trying to start? Iskander's got to tell his story. Like, how did this?
Oh, okay. Great questions. Okay, to quote Kurt Vonnegut, who came up with one of my favorite quotes, everything that follows is real except for the parts that aren't. So
Just hit me right in the feels.
it's
Big fan of Kurt Vonnegut. I have a Kurt Vonnegut candle that looks like a saint candle.
Oh my God.
It's Kurt Vonnegut.
It's
awesome. Yeah.
so
Yep,
cool.
he's my favorite.
Oh my God, I love that. Or as he once brilliantly described, a year in Indianapolis, one day at the races, and 364 days of miniature golf. Got to have a sense of humor like that. Oh, jeez, talk about a gift. I would say it was largely autobiographical, in the sense that all except two characters were based on people I have known.
Okay.
And the things that happen were things that have happened to me, but with a lot of, elaboration and different. The two characters who were not based on anybody were surprisingly Ben and Haswe. And when I first came up with those characters, I was thinking about a trope familiar from Saturday morning cartoons where the main character faces a moral dilemma, and suddenly an angel appears on one shoulder and a devil appears on the other shoulder. And the angel says, okay, do this because it's the right thing to do. And the devil says, well, yeah, it's the right thing to do, but do this instead because it's so much more fun.
Mm-hmm.
And since cartoons were for children, the character would always follow what the angel tells him to do, much to the devil's dismay, who then leaves in, a huff. And that's how I pictured the two of them. And in fact, when I first came up with the character of Ben, I had him so unlikable that I gave him the name Ben Abbott, and here is one of the most god-awful puns you will ever hear. Okay, so a little background on this. In Russian, people use patronymics, which is to say father's names.
Mm-hmm.
So if your name is Sergei and your father's name is Vasily, in formal company, you are addressed not as Sergei, but as Sergei Vasilyevich, Sergei, son of Vasily. Okay. There's something similar in Hebrew culture. So your name is Yaakov, your father's name is Ezra. If you were to walk into a synagogue, you'd be addressed not as Yaakov, but as Yaakov ben Ezra,
right.
Ben meaning son of. So to give my character the name Ben Abbott, I am, yes, basically saying son of a bitch.
That's hilarious.
And it was one of those fun things that I know nobody is going to pick up on. And that's what, the insecure artists like me love to do. It's like, you didn't get it. It was so funny, but you didn't get it. I feel so damn superior. So that's where it all came from.
So that character was based on Mark.
Absolutely. Has anybody seen the Progressive insurance commercials with Doug, who looks exactly like Mark? Maybe the emu looks a little bit more like Mark, but I think that Doug looks exactly like Mark. God, I hope he's not watching this.
I was going to say, I'm going to remove that from the recording.
Might want to.
Okay.
But
yeah, seriously.
Break it up.
At least they're not on camera. So, exactly.
Nobody knows who I am.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's also why you're using that voice modulator, right? So even that's not identified. I'm sorry, how long did it take you to write the book?
This is kind of frightening. It took me 4.5 months to write. It just literally was like turning on a faucet. It was like, it won't stop. And it was 3 times longer than the judges, and the judges took me 6 months. So when I first started this, I figured I'm going to give myself at least 1.5 years to get this done. But it just, oh my God. I mean, it's, like I would just, I'm watching my fingers move really fast. And all these words are appearing on my screen. I have no idea where they're coming from. Then I'd read it. It's like, who wrote this? It couldn't have been me. So it was an amazing experience. And I will be honest, some of the happiest moments of my life were spent writing this book. It really felt extraordinary to feel and get it all out. A lot of my earlier works were more emotionally restrained. Let's
Mhm.
but after I finished the Judges, I wasn't really going to write anything else, and then it's flickering in my mind, and it's like, no, no, no. Well, maybe.
Do you just sit down and write, or do you have post-its around the house, or
I
notes?
I actually I typed everything. When I started putting together scenes and characters and names, I would just, like type out a paragraph that I liked the sound of, or a scene that I liked the sound of. And then sometimes I'd go back to it, and sometimes I'd think of something else. What's really surprising is that by the time I actually started writing the book, I had almost 85 pages worth of little excerpts all written out. And the total book came to like 455 pages on my computer. So it was like I had almost 20% of the book already written by the time I started outlining it and kind of, pulling the things together.
Start the next one.
No, I am. Richard, is that going to be your question too?
No, all my questions have been answered except for one simple.
Oh, sure, sure.
At the end, his final painting that he was working
Yes, yes.
did that have any special meaning?
Yes, that's a great question, which is to say, I have a great answer. I had a friend who died very, very, very young. He was in his mid-30s, and he knew he was dying. And about a year before he died, he did something that completely blew me away. He bought a fixer-upper, and I thought,
Oh, stop.
not in good health, but he's buying this house to fix up. Why would he do that? And his brother explained something to me that I would never have come up with. His brother said he knows this house is going to take years to renovate. If he starts renovating it, he believes on some level he is going to fool fate, because fate will have to keep him alive long enough to finish this house. And that's exactly what Eskander is doing in his painting. Figures that it's going to take him 3.5 years to finish that painting. And so he thinks that by starting that painting, fate will have to allow him at least those 3 more years to stay alive. But as
Hello again. The Kurt Vonnegut line someone said earlier reminds me of a Harry Chapin line. Harry Chapin was talking about an album he'd produced, and he said that Watertown got more than it deserved in terms of applause. He said, I spent a week there one afternoon.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
But I got to tell you, Eric, the cat's out of the bag. One of your comments a few minutes ago, you said you finally got it all out. You just kept typing, and it all came to focus on your paper. That is, what do I want to say? That shows me that it is at least a semi-autobiographical book.
Yes, very definitely.
Well done.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Every book is semi-autobiographical.
I'd say so, because
You know.
really we like to think we know ourselves. but I think writing helps me understand things about myself that I really either didn't know or didn't want to know. Because it's not you in the book, it's somebody else. So you can, accept things in them that you wouldn't necessarily accept in yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
And very therapeutic, very, very therapeutic, yes. As far as writing another book goes, first, my apologies to people who have heard this before, but I have a very limited repertoire. So I will explain why I don't want to write another book. In a joke, it's my favorite joke. Saul Bellow said that everybody's life can be boiled down to about 10 really good jokes, and this was his personal favorite. And it's my favorite not because it's so funny, but because it's so true. It's the joke about the Italian opera singer. So, an Italian opera singer comes to Carnegie Hall to give a recital. Comes out on stage, he sings everything he's going to sing, and at the end, the audience bursts into riotous applause and starts screaming and shouting and stamping their feet and yelling, "Bravo, bravo, encore." He comes out and he does an encore. Well, the audience gets even more excited than they were the first time. And again, they're screaming and shouting and stamping their feet and yelling, "Bravo, bravo, encore, encore." But he comes out and does a second encore. Well, the audience cannot be satisfied. So they bring him out for a third encore. Then a fourth encore. Finally, after 5 encores, exhausted, dripping with sweat, the man bows humbly and says, "Thank you. But how much longer do I have to keep this up?" And somebody from the last row shouts back, "Until you get it right." And that's how I feel. I think this time I finally got it right and don't, keeping my fingers crossed, need to do any more encores. Another great line, as an inveterate collector of quotes, Somerset Maugham was a hugely prolific writer. He wrote hundreds of short stories and dozens of novels. And I think even his greatest admirers will say his writing could be very uneven. His masterpieces of human bondage, I think one of the greatest novels ever written. And then there are books of his that are good, books of his that are okay, and books of his that are, well, maybe kind of embarrassing. And he was in his mid-90s when he died. He was a huge celebrity. He lived on this palatial estate in the south of France with his partner, Gerald. And a couple of years before he died, a critic interviewed him and said, "You poured your entire life into Of Human Bondage. How come you were never able to write another novel that good?" To which Maugham very wisely replied, "Because I've had only one life." And that's pretty much the way I feel about this. It's like, this is just something I'm not going to be able to repeat.
Disappointed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That is very sweet to hear. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was really a lot of fun. And yeah, I would say that it was, yeah, it was just something that was just really therapeutic and fun and enlightening to be able to work on, and to have positive feedback is just like, the proverbial icing on the cake. So that's excellent.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.
So bad, right?
So the book is available at the library in physical and digital version. I just purchased the digital version. Yep. So, yep. So if you're interested, definitely take it out from here, or please buy a copy from Eric. You can sign it for you, right?
Yes, yes, I have copies for sale.
You have a pen?
I do not.
Okay, I will go get it.
Okay.
Put it on an audio.
Actually, I think I have a really nice one.
Oh,
Hold on just a
all
second.
right.
Would you consider an audio book?
I think I would actually. Although it was probably take like years to record.
I don't know how much are they expensive to do.
I don't know. That's a good question. That's a really good question.
Guess you have to rent. Well, do you really have to rent a studio?
Sure, I'm not sure.
Eric, did you ever find that print or lithograph, or did it just?
I did not.
Did you run down to a museum, look for it?
Yes, yes. They swear it has never been hanging on their wall.
I did a Google
Are you
search
sure it
for
wasn't
it.
Charity's back pocket?
Oh,
Oh,
maybe it was check. Yeah, that's another thing I keep thinking is that like
Find it.
maybe I got a word wrong somewhere or something. What's in Bob Hope's back pocket? There you go. Yes, yes. Wouldn't that have been Bing Crosby?
Great. So I think we're going to end the Zoom then. So thanks everybody for attending.